Welcome to another episode of the Columbia HXA podcast. I'm Anthony Rispo. In this episode, I had the privilege of speaking with Dr. Luke Conway, a professor of psychology at Grove City College and a leading voice in the study of the psychology of culture and politics. With a Ph.D. in social psychology from the University of British Columbia, Dr. Conway has authored over 80 articles, commentaries, and book chapters. He is the author of the book, Liberal Bullies: What Psychology Teaches Us About the Left's Authoritarian Problem and How to Fix It. He has, and continues to, significantly advance our understanding of the underpinnings of ideological beliefs. His work has appeared in outlets like The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Psychology Today, and he has been featured on platforms such as the Ben Shapiro podcast and Heterodox Academy. Dr. Conway also serves as an associate editor for the flagship journal of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. One of Dr. Conway's most groundbreaking contributions lies in his empirical exploration of left-wing authoritarianism. For decades, the study of authoritarianism was confined mainly to right-wing ideology, rooted in Theodor Adorno's 1950 work, The Authoritarian Personality, and later refined by social psychologist Bob Altemeyer with the right-wing authoritarianism scale. While these studies established authoritarianism as a significant psychological construct, scholars often dismissed the idea that authoritarian traits could manifest on the political left. Dr. Conway challenged this assumption, pioneering research that uncovered compelling evidence for left-wing authoritarianism as a distinct phenomenon. His work demonstrates that authoritarian traits such as aggression, intellectual rigidity, and conformity are not exclusive to one ideology. Dr. Conway's research provides a more nuanced and balanced understanding of authoritarianism by showing how these traits differ in expression across the political spectrum. This episode explores Dr. Conway's compelling pursuit of empirical balance in social psychology. In this field, liberal perspectives not only dominate but often recycle and reinforce their own assumptions. Perhaps most concerning, these assumptions frequently go unchallenged, leading to confirmation bias and, ironically, cognitive dissonance and resistance when confronted. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoy this thought provoking conversation with Dr. Luke Conway. So thank you so much for joining me today. This is a conversation I've been wanting to have. Actually, I'm really glad that I was able to even get a hold of you. This is a topic that has interested me for a very long time, and it probably is what got me back into school for psychology. To be honest with you, left-wing authoritarianism. So could you uh, introduce yourself for a little bit to the audience and let them know what you do and what you're about and your research?
Yeah, so I'm Luke Conway. I'm a psychology professor at Grove City College. I got my PhD at the University of British Columbia in social psychology, so that's my specialty area. My main areas of study that I've done research on, I've published almost 100 papers, have to do with cultural beliefs. So, where does culture come from? How does it form? And cognitive complexity. So, what causes people to have complex versus simple thoughts? And authoritarianism, sort of at the center of those things, since authoritarianism involves a lot of simple thinking and is culturally relevant. So, that's my background. I'm associate editor of a PSPB, one of the top journals in my field. An elected fellow of CESP and also of SPSP, research fellow. So I've done quite a bit of work and research. I'm a research oriented person who is interested in topics relevant to culture.
Yeah. So you mentioned. Thank you for that. By the way, you mentioned authoritarianism, and this is a word that gets thrown around so much. Would you agree that it
hmm
just it gets tossed around so much? Maybe we could start with that defining. I mean, that's a hard thing I know coming upon this issue of like, well, what is authoritarianism anyway? But your best research shot at it. What is authoritarianism actually?
Yeah, so authoritarianism isn't obeying your parents or obeying speed limits. So we need good authority to function. Authoritarianism, to people like me who study it, to academics, is inherently nastier. It's wanting an authority
Yeah.
figure to crush your enemies. So it's inherently group based nastiness. To an authoritarian, logic, reason, laws, principles, even ideologies aren't their thing. Authoritarians care about their group. So laws and principles are just tools that are applied unequally, what we call group based asymmetry. So authoritarians don't want speed limits to be applied to, you go back to that metaphor, don't want speed limits
Yeah.
to be applied equally to everybody. They want different rules for you that are more restrictive than they want for themselves. They use ideologies and laws and rules. They don't want them to apply equally to everyone. So one of the antidotes to authoritarianism is actually a principle or a law that's equally applied. That's not the authoritarian mindset. So
Yeah.
when I'm
So
talking about it, that's what I'm thinking about. Authoritarian measurements tend to measure like, I want this authoritarian leader to come in and just crush my enemies. That's what we're talking about when we talk about it in the literature.
right. So like fundamentally, you have authoritarianism as this. How would you say? Well, maybe if I start with, you have these ideologies that, when mixed to this authoritarian propensity or drive to control, it gets a certain flavor, which is where you get left wing. The differentiation between these like types, left wing and right wing, is that kind of
Hmm. An
yeah,
excellent point. Like when we're talking about left wing and right wing authoritarianism, it starts with the idea that authoritarianism is group based, so
yeah,
that means that you can't really understand an authoritarian fully until you answer the question, authoritarianism to what? Like, what is their group? What is the thing they're authoritarian to? So you can be in a bat hating group and be not authoritarian in that group, or you can be an authoritarian bat hater. You can be a bat loving authoritarian or a bat loving non-authoritarian. So
mm,
ideology is kind of the often is the blanket on which the group goes around. And so when we take left wing versus right wing authoritarian, there's sort of broad terms we use to describe the typical
yeah,
groups in those umbrellas that people tend to say when we say, what are they authoritarian to? Well, left wingers tend to be authoritarian to traditionally left wing causes, and right wingers tend to be authoritarian to traditionally right wing causes. But when I say ideology is a tool, you can see that in just take something like vaccine anti-vax movement. The anti-vax
yeah,
movement actually came from the left. Back in 2015, it was a
yeah, right,
left-wing
right,
movement. Okay, but then COVID switched. Everybody switched sides in the middle of the night. That just illustrates the ideology wasn't about some principle that was going to be applied. It was actually about the group that person felt like they were a part of, a left-wing identity, if you will.
and that was the autism movement, or autism is caused by vaccines movement, or is it
Well,
something?
I think no. Okay, part of it, perhaps,
Yeah,
yeah. But I wasn't specifically thinking of that. I was actually thinking more of the idea that vaccines, like the anti-vax movement, was mostly. You can look at this in 2017. What was the status of thing?
hmm,
Conservatives actually supported traditional medicine, and vaccines were traditional medicine. That was the state of things. Okay, so it was more like liberal hippies who would say we
ah,
want natural. We don't trust all of this
ah,
modern
right,
science. Okay,
right,
that
right, right,
now that's not
yeah,
most left wingers. Most people on both sides actually support vaccines. So that okay, but my point is
yeah, yeah,
that changed because of a political event that happened where Biden decided to take the vaccine that the Trump administration had made and turn it into this very simple solution. That we can disagree or agree about that, but the point is that's just an illustration of how it's not really the principle so much as it is about the group identity. That's what drives authoritarianism. It's not about equally applied principle or ideological principle as much as it is this is my group and I want an authority figure to come and ensure that my group does better than the other group.
yeah. Okay, that's very clear. And so the juicy part, what I would love to talk about for sure, is you have a book, Liberal Bullies, what psychology teaches us about the left's authoritarian problem and how to fix it. So, um, just broadly speaking, I guess to anchor us, what is left wing authoritarianism? And I guess to add to that a little side part with how does it differ from right-wing authoritarianism?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it has similarities and commonalities. The history of this,
Hmm.
by the way, might be a little helpful here.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, yeah.
So, the history of this, there's an irony in the history if you consider authoritarianism group-based asymmetry, that this is an exaggeration of the historical story, but it's not that far off to say that basically for the first 50 years or so, there was an assumption in the literature from most researchers that authoritarianism was an exclusively right wing phenomenon. Okay. That was the
Right, right.
origin of the term back in the 50s. It was mostly applied to right wingers. That was the zeitgeist of what people said about it. And so, what does that mean? Well, that means that ironically, there was a kind of group based asymmetry in focus, which led to the belief that this was mostly a right wing thing. But that was kind of like saying people don't like ice cream because we've never studied it and we only study the people liking broccoli. Like, it was basically because people only develop measurements to look at right wing authoritarianism, we never got to left wing authoritarianism at all. Now, to answer your question, well, left wing authoritarianism is just people supporting. They want left wing authorities to crush and censor and bully the right wingers. They want their groups in power. So in the modern world, that often has to do with critical race theory. It has to do with educational theories that people coalesce around. It has to do a lot with the green movement. That's one of the most authoritarian movements these days from the left. Okay, very. So they want this one size fits all simplistic solution to some problem that they coalesce around, and then they're just wanting authority figures to come in and make everybody do that thing to the benefit of their own cause or group. Now, similarities, well, you can't be authoritarian if you don't, like, there's a similarity that has to exist between right and left wing authoritarians for them to be authoritarian. So they have to want to bully, they have to want a strong authority figure to exact punishment. They have to not care as much about principle as about groups. So they
Right,
do
right.
left and right wing share that. Now, what they differ on is obviously they differ on some of the ideological causes. They tend to be on opposite sides. The content of their beliefs is obviously different. They differ clearly in the authority figures they follow. Okay, so they differ on
Yeah.
some of those, but psychologically, they do share some differences in our data. So one of those is the blind spot, the ignorance. Right wing authoritarians, if you ask them, "Are you an authoritarian?" are more likely to say yes. So they just said, "I'm going to crush my enemies." And we asked them point blank, "Well, do you think you're an authoritarian?" And they go, "Yeah, I'm an authoritarian." Left wingers will say the exact same language. They'll say, I want to crush my enemies. I hate the other group. I want to, and then you say, "Are you an authoritarian?" And they go, "No." They're actually higher scores on the left wing authoritarianism scale are incredibly correlated with
That,
lower self-reports of their own authoritarianism, and that's our data suggests that they have this blind spot because they think their group disapproves of authoritarianism. So they have this kind of hypocritical blind spot. They don't think their authoritarianism is authoritarian, whereas conservatives do. Also, left-wing authoritarians these days are much more likely to want to censor. Right-wing
yeah, yeah,
authoritarians are
yeah, yeah.
less. So that's not to the horn of right-wing authoritarians who are generally,
Sure.
that's awful, but it's more just that's a psychological difference in the way it's currently playing out.
Well, and also it's interesting because people ask me from time to time, why do you focus so much now on criticizing the left, and why don't you have an even hand about the right? And my answer is pretty simple. It's that the left dominates entertainment, they dominate the media, they're infiltrated. The ideas on the left have infiltrated our culture for decades upon decades in the academy. And just a quick point, I wanted to go back to what you said about this blind spot. There's a similar effect. We interviewed two political scientists about respect, how the left and the right, or liberals and conservatives, show respect to the other, to the partisans. And there was a paradox for liberals there also, that they have this egalitarian sense and orientation, and they believe in respect for all people, etc., etc. But when it comes time to respect conservatives, they have much lower levels of what they have operationalized as recognition respect. They
Mm-hmm.
call, so they broke it down to two types of respect: recognition respect and civic respect. Yeah, recognition respect was just respect for you as a human, just purely as a human being. Just the fact that you are a human being, I respect you. And they scored very low on that towards conservatives, and not the other way around. Conservatives didn't score low on that variable towards liberals. So there was this cognitive dissonance, this paradox. Also,
Mm-hmm.
I find that to be really interesting to know that a similar paradox exists here, and I can't put my finger on exactly why that is. But the only thing that really offers some kind of answer is this sense of egalitarianism, that it's your ought, like I ought to do this. This is my duty to protect, and it's almost like a religious kind of directive. Is I don't know. What would you say about that?
I agree with
All of the
that. I
yeah
agree with that. I think I mean, that's what our data suggest about authoritarianism. I don't know about that other finding you said. I do
yeah
know data in our field which suggests right now a lot of increasing amount of data which suggests that conservatives are much more likely to show empathy to liberals than vice versa. Conservatives are much more open to
mm,
a dialogue between the two groups than liberals are. And it doesn't surprise me at all to find out that liberals have a bit of a blind spot to that weakness that they currently have compared to conservatives. It feels a bit like unrequited love right now. You know, conservatives are trying to reach out across the aisle often. I feel this often, and they're rebuffed. Like we're not going to have a dialogue with you because we just think you're bad. Now, I don't think that's true of most liberals, but that's the I do think there's a bit of an asymmetry right now on that domain, and academia is has a blind spot for that. One of my
yeah
all-time favorite
yeah
quotes. I don't know if you know Lee Jussum, who's
yeah. I don't know
terrific.
him personally,
Yeah,
but
he's
I've read his
great.
work a lot.
I saw
Yeah
him give a talk. Now you have to understand the pretext of this is I'm the guy that's studying left-wing authoritarianism. I'm the guy that's trying to point out some of the asymmetries in the past. And Lee Jussum got up and he said last year at a conference, we had people asking which of these two alternatives was the correct alternative. Are conservatives uniquely bad, or are conservatives and liberals equally
mhm.
bad and good? And then he just asked this question: why are those the only two alternatives? And I just went, I, I I'm the guy studying left wing authoritarianism, and I didn't actually think of that legitimate possibility that sometimes the asymmetry goes in a way that's bad for that makes liberals like I'm a facts guy. Sometimes
Yeah,
conservatives do look bad. That sometimes they have been worse. Our own
sure,
data
sure.
right now suggests they're slightly more right wing than left wing authoritarianism. Back to your original question, I want to get back to that. Great
Yeah,
question you asked about why we're focusing on left wing authoritarianism.
yeah,
Okay, but I do think that paradox that you described is probably the same paradox as the one we're talking about, and the psychology of it. I think it comes from our data suggests group-based norms. So there are strong norms in liberals that conservatives don't have that suggest they should. Same thing with openness. We asked a question in our recent data: do you think your group wants you to be an open-minded person? And liberals say yes, and conservatives are like, meh. Okay, so they that's and that's not bad. That's actually a good norm. So I don't think the solution is to try to make everybody believe we should be closed-minded. I don't think that's the right angle for it, but that's what drives it. Is they don't there's an authoritarian growth behind the scenes that meets this norm, and when they
yeah.
meet, the authoritarian says, well, I want to be like a good member of my group, and so doggone it, I'm open-minded as I'm crushing my enemies and refusing to have Thanksgiving dinner with my conservative relatives. So
Right,
that's
right.
that's the vibe. Now, if I can,
Signaling going on. Yeah,
yeah, correct. Now, which happens on both sides, by the way. It's just more prominent in liberals, I think, is what data and experience suggests to me. So now back to your point about why we study left-wing authoritarianism. It's a legitimate question. We're doing Our lab is about to put out sometime in the next 2 months. We're working on the backstory. We're going to launch an authoritarianism tracker where we track authoritarianism and rate it around the country. And when people say authoritarian, is this authoritarian? Yes or no? And we're going to, and one of the things we're consciously trying to do, even though, I'm a conservative independent, I work at one of the most conservative colleges in the country, is to be even-handed about it, right? Is to focus
yeah,
on authoritarianism, to try to apply an equal standard. main antidote to authoritarianism is a principle applied equally across both sides.
Yeah.
So I'm trying. I want to do that, and I do think that right-wing authoritarianism is still a problem. It's been a problem in the
Yeah.
country. It's still a problem. So I don't want to. And I have a lot to say about the current election and where we're going with that. So I don't want to just focus on left-wing authoritarianism. Now, my answer to the question is the same as yours. I would get okay. Why do I study
Yeah.
it? Well, all of our institutions for a long time have been
Yeah.
dominated by the left, and one of the things that happens is it creates apathy. People they're not challenged, and that tends to devolve into a lazy thing that's a fertile ground for authoritarianism. And so we've got
Yeah.
a lot of people right now who have been in power for a long time, academia in particular, that just are. And you referenced communication mechanisms, absolutely, that have been just
Mm-hmm.
absolutely dominated by people who are censoring and so on. So that's been a problem. Why do I study it? Well, nobody else studied it. It's like, okay, like you can't ignore this issue for 50 years. Okay,
Right.
which is what
Right. And it does
you can,
go. It
yeah.
goes back that far. It does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can't
Yeah.
ignore this issue for 50 years and then whine when somebody comes along and says, "Hey, maybe we should study this thing." Okay, so to me, that's just it's low-hanging fruit from an intellectual point of view
Sure. Sure.
because it's just sitting there. Obviously, there are left-wing authoritarians, okay? And so it's just sitting there to study, and so that's why I get into it. But I've also studied right-wing authoritarianism, and almost every study I run has both, and we talk about both. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I
That's
actually do
clear.
think it's important. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the history. I know we don't have lots of time to go down the pike of this extensive. It's so intricate because it converges. It intersects with so many different moments in history and academic history in our country, just over the past 5 decades or 6 decades. But could you just give us like a, I guess, a short version of the history of why we've been in this quagmire, in this sort of calcified environment where people just refuse that, or until recently have refused that this exists even. They've called it the Loch Ness Monster or something,
Mm-hmm.
being left-wing authoritarianism. Why has there been such a pushback historically?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, as recently as 2020. So this isn't, there was a famous paper calling left-wing authoritarianism the Loch Ness Monster from the 80s, but as recently
Yeah.
as 2020, at a conference, a group of colleagues said left-wing authoritarianism is still the Loch Ness Monster. It's a myth. There's not, so they call the existence of meaningful numbers of left-wing authoritarians a myth. So that's still a view that's held, kind of an entrenched view that's held. Look, um, some of the people that have said that are close colleagues of mine, and I like them. I don't agree with them a lot. I like them. I don't want this statement to be misconstrued like I'm saying all of these
Sure.
people are left-wing authoritarians. But the truth is, there's just a huge ideological group-based bias that's long been studied in social psychology. If you remove authoritarianism from it, you look at just social identity theory.
Right.
John
Exactly.
Haidt pointed this out. Okay, that people tend to defend their tribe. People draw self-esteem from the fact that their tribe is better than the other tribe, that their group is better than the other group. And to a lot of my colleagues, this idea of liberalism is their religion. It is the thing that motivates them. Okay, and so that my strong sense, having been in the field, is that this came from a long history of social identity. Now, I personally, my own story would be that up until 2016, I mean, I was a longtime liberal independent, so just keep that in mind. I mean, I sort of fit in with the crowd to some degree, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was that bad. I really, it felt like there was kind of a hazy group bias, but there was not this overt sense of hatred. And I feel like Trump plus COVID sort of broke a lot of people. It just made them so mad and so angry.
Yeah.
So that's just I'm not saying data suggests that about academia, but I think there was this long history of bias plus Trump plus COVID, and there was this seed there that was just germinating or waiting for water, and it got this facilitation that caused this, but I don't know that for sure. The academy has long leaned liberal. It's always, as long as I can remember, as long as it's been tested, the academy's been more liberal than the populace in the
Yeah.
U.S.
And then there's the issue of, I think Lee Justin talks about embedded values in
Mm-hmm.
research, like how it's almost like, well, this is now my take on it. It's like almost like airplane air when you lead with an assumption um, in your research that puts forward the idea that you're trying to explore as conclusive already, like, you
Mm-hmm.
know, uh, basically it's basically leading with a conclusion rather than an assumption that's based on some observation. And I guess this can also, we don't have to go into this, but one example that comes to mind is the microaggression literature. The fact that researchers in that domain believe for a fact that they've got it down. They've got the measure. They've got a way to measure this thing, and so they lead with the assumption that they have it, and then it just
Mm-hmm.
kind of like it confirms their bias over and over and over again. And then another paper is published, and it just leads down the research trails, and then it becomes the idiom. It becomes the way people think about things, and it then permeates our culture. And then people refer to things that they don't understand. Lay people who are not researching, they'll call things microaggressions. They won't even know that it's not a really solid construct. So it's like it's. I don't know if any of that rings true, or if it's something that I think it does apply though to this when people think about left-wing authoritarianism versus right-wing authoritarianism. They they anchor themselves into their virtue, into their moralizing of issues. And this is just what I've been seeing since Trump has won and before Trump won this past
Mm-hmm.
election. It's this idea that by default, anybody that could support him is therefore a vicious, terrible, um, just vermin. Is how could you? I'm going to delete you for my life, nonetheless, Facebook or social media. But it's this digging one's heels into this moralizing of the world that keeps them from seeing nuance. And I know you can see that in authoritarianism, sure, on both ends and just generally speaking. But what makes left-wing authoritarianism? Um, See, this is my view, and I'm really curious what you think. What makes it a bit more insidious and like to me it feels, maybe we touched on it a bit already, being that it's pervasive in our culture and in our media and entertainment. But what makes it a little more, I'm reluctant to say dangerous, but I guess we'll go there. Like, what is it about this fever that's so frightening?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I don't think it's inherently more dangerous than right wing
Right.
authoritarianism. So I don't think that. I think in some sense right now there's a danger in the other direction, which I do want to talk about a little bit. So
Okay, good. Yeah.
I don't know that I don't know that I think that there's something inherently more evil. I think it feels worse to in some ways because of the hypocrisy element of it that is so prevalent, that left-wing authoritarians sort of gaslit the country for so long and said that,
Yeah.
like what you said, that does feel very insidious behind the scenes. Like you're telling me that I'm a racist while you're being racist to me consistently. That's yeah.
That's what I mean. I want to clarify. It's the hypocrisy. It's that. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
look, but can I just say something?
Yeah.
Both sides have their hypocrisies, both right and left on that. And I would be willing
Yeah.
to bet, I haven't done this study. I have a little bit of data on this, but I haven't done a full study on this. I'd be willing to bet that right wing authoritarians have a similar hypocrisy. If you change the word to freedom, that right wing authoritarians tend to talk in terms of freedom. Okay, they don't
Yeah.
talk. They don't talk. They're fine saying I'm authoritarian, but then you say, "Why are you authoritarian?" Well, I want freedom, and they'll do that as they're
Yeah.
trying to deny freedom to the other side on some
Yeah.
dimension. So I actually think if we got behind the veil a bit and we did a lot of studies. Now, I would love to do more studies like that. Honestly, I have to spend so much of my money and time just trying to convince a lot of people that left-wing authoritarianism was a quasi-real phenomenon, I didn't want to do that. I'm more interested in the question that you just asked, which is how are they similar and different? And okay, so
Yeah.
I don't. So here's what my point, and I could be wrong about this. Okay, but my point is my own read of my own data and my own read of other people's data and my own read of where we're at is I don't think that there's an inherently less evil side to or bad side to right-wing authoritarianism. And I think there's just as many or more right now in the country, not by many, but as right-wing as left-wing authoritarian. So I don't think that's the issue. I feel also as you do personally that left-wing authoritarianism is more dangerous right now, and I think it's just because they've had so much power. It's what you said earlier. Okay, I think
Yeah.
it's a power discrepancy. I also feel like subjectively like right wingers are more likely to hold their right wing authoritarians in check. They're a little bit more self aware on average of the problem. Okay. Like if I ask the
Mm-hmm.
average liberal, do you see that this thing that Biden did, which he did a bunch of authoritarian things. Do you see that this thing that Biden did, when Biden said, "I'm going to ignore the Supreme Court," and he just said, "I'm just going to do this." That's one of the hallmarks of authoritarian. I'm just going to ignore the rules. I'm just going to apply this rule in a way that I want to do that benefits my group. So he does all these authoritarian things, and I say to liberals, "Do you see that?" And most of them seem to say, "No, it seems fine." But I say to conservatives, "Do you see that Trump's has done some things that are kind of bad?" And some of them are like kind of in the cult, right? They're like, no, Trump can do no wrong. But more
Yeah.
conservatives
Yeah.
than liberals seem right now willing to say, I really like the guy, and I think he does some authoritarian things, but he's the best option we got. So I feel like
Ah.
there's a
Yeah. Yeah.
bit
Yeah. Yeah.
more
Yeah.
cultural normativeness in conservatism right now. I don't think that was true 30 years ago at all, but right
Right.
now
Right.
people forget
You.
like the initial cancel culture was conservative moral majority. Like
Oh yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that was why I used to be liberal. I didn't like that bullying mindset. So I think we're talking about right now. I think it's because of the increased power and they made these two things may be related, but it's the increased power which you referenced, but also I think there's more of a tendency for conservatives to serve as a check on their own issues. That might be
Yeah.
wrong, but
Yeah. No. And I think to backtrack, I don't know if I said inherently, and that is a dangerous word to use, especially
you
in
didn't.
in.
You didn't. Yeah.
Okay.
To be
Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
No. No. I just wanted to correct just because
Yeah.
that is not a, yeah. That's the but I think for me generationally, the reason why it's so salient is because just full disclosure. I mean, I was the guy who threw a fit when people didn't put a black box on their Instagram when George Floyd was killed. It's I had such a transformation and evolution from my own authoritarian ways on the left, and I've been there. I have the, as you call it, receipts. Little posts that I would put up and some videos denigrating Trump supporter. It was just terrible, terrible, and so now I'm on the outside of that, and I see just this past
Mhm.
election watching how people are responding and having this sort of split thinking about reality, just all good or all bad. um and I'm looking at it from afar now. I'm like, my god, this has reached such a fever pitch. And in retrospect, looking back, I'm 30, I'm going to be 35, and so I grew up in the 90s with a lot of the PC movement and the gentle parenting movement and all this stuff. So I think it's just that now that I'm awake to uh, what the left, I'm just going to be very very honest, like to what that left mindset has done culturally. It just feels harder to address, because so many people in this area, in this way of thinking, they really don't believe. So they'll go to January 6th, they'll go to these very stark examples. And then, the absolutists on the right, which obviously are influenced by a lot of, right leaning evangelical thinking. And so they'll often point to those characters, but there's still, and maybe we're looping a bit, but I just want to kind of ride this home a bit. Like, there's still this unawareness of one's own propensity, one's own tendency to be controlling and to sabotage. And I wanted to ask you, what, this is a good place to segue into what characteristics particularly define left-wing authoritarianism? Because I think that could actually help make it clearer. Aren't there about three? Like, is it like top-down censorship or
Yeah, so
yeah?
right, misinformation obsession, that's the censorship
Right.
obsession, right? Okay.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
one. Intellectual apathy, so not wanting to think hard, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's another one. Paired that with a tendency to think in simple black and white terms. So
Mm.
that's, like microaggressions was an example of that. That just the world is, everything is about white supremacy, everything is about race. Group asymmetry also fits with that. So the tendency to, we've
Right.
already talked about that one. So that's so yeah, you've got these sort of things, and a lot of the examples you use fit all of those things. Microaggressions fit all of those things. I mean, I pointed out in the book, like nobody. I thought it was comical when a reviewer of the book said, "Well, actually, technically, those microaggression things don't say that it's only from a white person to someone else." And I'm like, "Okay, go ahead and try that. See how it works. If you claim that a black person is doing a microaggression against a white person, and see how it works. Like it's asymmetrical. Okay, so it,
Right.
it needs
Right.
a lot of these things." And you're right about the microaggressions, by the way. That's why I spend a lot of time on it in Liberal Bullies. That's just you can't ask someone, where are you
Yeah.
from? It's inferred. Like there's literally nothing you can do. It's like when Earl Warren said the best evidence of Japanese spy activity, that the Japanese Americans were spies, was that they weren't doing anything. Well, but they because that's what spies do. You would expect them to be covert. I'm like, but I'm just asking where you're
Right.
from. Like there's just human conversation. Sometimes that is used in a racist way. Of course, anything can be used in a racist way. The nicest thing on earth could be used in a racist way, but you're just inferring. Well, that's intellectual apathy. That's black and white thinking. That's like you are determined to force feed this particular viewpoint in black and white terms on the world. So
Right.
those. So I think to your question, those are mostly traits that are shared by right and left wing authoritarians. Intellectual apathy is a shared trait. Simplicity is a shared trait. They differ on what things they draw the line on, but I don't think that the modern authoritarians, the left, is misinformation obsession. That's new. I mean, that's not new. That's actually an old authoritarian playbook, but that's all right. Our other people's data suggests that that's kind of unique to left wingers.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what because and that's what I've been noticing in university. Just there's an obsession with I'm taking a course and just leave it at that. And um, there's this obsession with misinformation, disinformation, and how to spot it. And like I was getting at before, it's just it seems to be under the veil of compassion, of empathy, of doing what's right. It's that seems to be the motivation, and it's really hard to argue with a person who cares about justice and all these really important things, but it it it's at what expense? It's like, so you want to, so for instance, with migrants right now, you have more left-leaning churches and denominations who are now taking in migrants and their asylum status. They've become asylum entities, and on its face you think, okay, it's not the government, it's the church, that
Sure,
they have the right to do that, and in
sure,
theory when you zoom out you're like, okay, that's great. But then it's what comes after. It's the it's the it's the view that if you don't partake, or if you don't agree, if you're part of that church and you voice concern, let's say, about your safety and very real things, then by default you are irredeemable. You're on that side, and it's using. And I wonder if you could speak to this. It's using that moral claim as a means to control people, um, and to essentially cast them as maybe even lesser, or just, again, like those people out to the side who don't want justice, who don't want fairness, who don't want. But then it also comes at the expense of one's well-being. It's like, well, what if you are putting somebody in jeopardy? Then how do you how do you really make sense of that? You're trying to facilitate justice and all these other great things, but sometimes it backfires, and there seems to be that blind spot too. I don't know.
No, I agree. I mean, there's a couple different things there. One is the moral imperative,
Yeah.
which I think is not unique to left-wing authoritarians. I mean, the right-wing authoritarian probably glommed onto the moral majority, which had moral in the name, and it was just it was a different kind of morality, right? It wasn't about misinformation so much; it was just about purity and other things. So, but to your point, yeah, I that's my experience too. Is this? It's an obsession with. But look, here's the problem with it. It's not really it's talked about as if it's about misinformation, but behind that is the belief that only your side has the right information. Okay, that's a dangerous, arrogant,
Yeah.
godlike. You have a god complex if you think that literally, if the other side says something you don't like, that's misinformation,
Yeah.
which is what happened
Yeah.
during COVID, by the way. That was just nuts. Okay, that was nuts. And you're right about immigration too. So it gloms on a bit to the woke language norms, political correctness. You can see that with some of the backlash that the Massachusetts um, Democrat got when he tried to say, "Hey, we should be able to talk about these transgender issues," and then he was just bludgeoned by his own party, right? So
Right.
he's like, "We
Right.
can't even talk right now." Has to do partially with misinformation and partially with these policing of woke norms. And I feel
Right.
exactly the same thing you feel privately. Like I felt that for a long time. Years ago, I would say if I wanted to talk about politics and debate, I would do it with my colleagues in academia. Now it's like I would do it with my church. For years, I would say I don't talk about it with my colleagues. If I want to debate something, I go to my conservative friends in church and debate with them because that's fine with that group. So privately, I feel the shift. A lot of people have said that too privately. They feel this shift that, here at Grove, we debate stuff all the time at our little conservative Christian college. We're fine debating um, pros and cons of policies and conservative policies and so on. But I don't know that I've felt that very keenly in a lot of the other sort of more liberal academic circles I'm in right now.
Yeah. 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 It's in the book. You also you talk chapter 6. You talk about kind of going back to the misinformation issue. It's this idea of you trusting the authority, trusting the science, trust the teachers. It's not an argument. It. Don't push back, or it's the idea of dissent itself
Mm-hmm.
is a signal to some degree that there's a oh, you're a problem. So
Right.
it's we found this with the trust the science issue with COVID, but then it's the very same folks who have a very hard time accepting gender medicine science being inconclusive and actually quite dangerous for minors. And there's this intractable. You can't get through to some people who when they have a like a moral imperative, like you said, and it becomes very clear that it's not about the science; it's about controlling a narrative. That's what it seems to me, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe but I want to give the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I don't want to um, say that everybody is trying to control others consciously, but it's this buy-in. Is what I'm guessing. I mean, I know that's what I felt when I was back in before 2020 or during a little bit of 2020. Also, I was going nuts when people wouldn't get vaccinated and all that. But what is this? Do you see this particularly, as you said before about misinformation being somewhat unique to the left? Do you see this trust the authorities, trust the science, trust the educators a lot more on the left too? Does that follow with the misinformation thing?
I think that I look, that to me is just about group norms and group
Mm-hmm.
shifts in group norms. Uh, Conservatives trusted traditional medicine when it was viewed more conservatively.
Yeah.
They distrust it now that it's viewed as a partisan liberal issue, and vice versa. So I think that the history of that is actually illustrating the point about how ideology is more shifting based on group norms shifting than it is about the principle or ideology. But yes, of course, I feel all of that you felt, that you said. I agree with that subjectively. I will add that since we haven't had a chance to talk about this,
Yeah.
that the number of left-wing authoritarians and the number of right-wing authoritarians, I mean, look, it's a continuous scale. Everybody has slightly authoritarian tendencies. Everybody
Sure.
can be want their enemies to suffer. Like that's just a human instinct. Everybody wants a strong authority figure. There's nothing wrong with wanting a strong authority figure. You just want someone who's going to be a good leader. So so everybody has some of those tendencies. We're all angels and ogres. We're just talking about people at the upper end of the scale, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
are just
Yeah.
really authoritarian, and that group of people is not. It's a large in terms of number, absolute number, but percentages. That's actually not most of the country. Most of the country is
Right.
kind of more authoritarian, tolerant. Like I don't like it, but I'm just going to look the other way, or they don't like it and they're not looking the other way. But there's not. So I'm saying that to say part of our problem right now is we have inaccurate views of the other side, which makes us afraid of them. So we just collected a study. You ask people, do you personally support Hitler? Everybody says no. The mean on that scale, on a 1 to 7 scale, the mean of that was 1.1. So it's hard to picture in terms to the person who doesn't do a lot of data analysis how low of a mean that is, but that's almost nobody ever says in the country that they support Hitler and the Nazis on either side. But then you ask liberals, do you think conservatives, what do you think they're going to score? And their mean of what they think is like 2 points above the, they have
Wow. Yeah.
this it's just shockingly large misconception about what conservatives believe. Conservatives also have that, by the way. They also think that liberals support Hitler a lot more than they do. It's just not quite as big of a gap. Um,
Wow.
but my point is,
Yeah.
I could show you across a lot of different things. Conservatives think liberals support eco-terrorism. Almost none of them do. Uh, liberals think that conservatives believe that Taylor Swift is a CIA operative. Almost no conservative actually believe that. So you have these radical, almost conspiracies about
Wow.
conspiracy theories, that people have these false beliefs about what the other. And here's my point. That's part of our problem. Part of our problem is simply we need the cold light of truth to shine and show that actually most people right now aren't these like radical authoritarians on both sides. There are a problem on both sides. There is a problem with this on both sides in the country, but we need to not exaggerate because that's correlated with fear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in our data, that's correlated with fear of threat, is misbeliefs about the other group, and that's correlated with authoritarianism. So,
Right.
so
Makes sense
that's
behaviorally, cognitively. Yep. Mm-hmm.
yeah. So
Yep.
that's part of the problem. Um,
Yeah.
Now we didn't get a chance to. I was hoping we could talk about one of the questions you prepped me with was why Trump won. So I was hoping we
Oh
could get
yeah.
to that before I had to leave because I did want to talk about that
I would love
question.
that. Yeah. Yeah. I'd
Okay.
love to. Yeah.
Okay. So and mostly I just wanted to say, as someone who studied this a lot empirically, the New York Times and other people have made this case, mostly by fiat, I think, but they've made this argument that the American populace that was brazenly voting for authoritarianism when they voted for Trump, so that the idea was that Trump won because he is authoritarian and the American populace just wanted that. That is not intellectually credible. Okay.
Right.
We just said, first of all, no one supports Hitler and the Nazis. So that's just, okay, that there are conservatives who say they support Hitler and the Nazis. They're just so small that that's not like conservatism
Right.
is correlated with that. So more conservatives, and even in our data, say that than liberals, that they support it. But that's like saying Muslims are terrorists because Islam is correlated with terrorism, which it is in this country, correlated with terrorist behavior. But the base rate of the behavior is so small, almost nobody does terrorism. Muslims don't either. The vast majority of them are patriotic U.S. citizens. So that's just
Right.
it's just a false narrative. But I also wanted to say we've studied this since 2008. Okay, about authoritarianism. What is the relationship between authoritarianism on the left and the right and voting outcomes? So we started studying this in 2008.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is this election an outlier? Okay, authoritarianism is always, when you do proper controls, especially for the group that's not in power, tends to be predictive of voting for their candidate. Okay.
Yeah.
The effects are small but real. So you would expect that based on our prior data, you would expect that there would be a small but real effect of authoritarianism, right-wing authoritarianism predicting Trump support. And there was. That's what our early data show. I'm pretty sure that's going to be a real effect, small but real, accounting for a tiny amount of the variance of the vote for Trump, probably like 1% to 2% max. So very small but real effect. Is it reasonable to infer from that was a vote for authoritarianism? No, because if you infer that, you have to there's even a larger effect for left-wing authoritarians voting for Obama in 2008. So if you're going to do an honest comparison, you'd have to then say the country. I can't wait to see the New York Times, op-ed from 2008 where they said, "Oh my gosh, the country voted for an authoritarian." No. If we're doing an honest comparative analysis of data, that case is simply ludicrous. So that's all I wanted to say. I just because you asked this question in your prep about is that a reasonable point of view, and the idea that that's what the country was voting for. Actually, a better predictor in our data, just to give you a sense, was conservatives who thought that incorrectly thought that liberals supported Nazism were more likely to vote for Trump. Well, they weren't voting in favor of Nazism. They were actually voting against it. So there's just no credible case to be made that this was an outlier vote for authoritarianism, and the people who are saying that should stop. Like we have to combat that idea, because it's not empirical. I don't like everything Trump does. We could talk about Trump. That's a different issue. He's a mixed bag. I don't agree with everything he does. Some of what he does has been, in my mind, kind of authoritarian. Not more authoritarian than Biden, but so if we're just comparing apples to apples, but I try to have an even keel about this. But the case that this is what the American populace was voting for an authoritarian is absurd. It's just not empirically credible. That's all.
No, thank you for that. Thank you, really. So I know you're pressed for time, and I think the last thing that just to close out, where to go from here, what we do, and especially someone like myself who is wanting to dip into the research world as a perhaps emerging psychologist. I haven't figured out what's next in my life as of this recording, but
come and join us.
Yeah, that'd be pretty amazing, actually.
We could use smart people who are interested in finding out the truth about this. Sorry, go ahead. I cut you off.
No. I appreciate it so much. Yeah, greatly appreciate that. Yeah, I think one recurring theme is, I've been sort of talking about left-wing authoritarianism, left-wing, but I think, where do we go from here? Do we center ourselves, anchor ourselves in a discussion of extremism, ideology, dogmatism, generally speaking, and look at it from like this both sides perspective? I mean, we should, of course, from a research perspective, but because we're coming from this post-mortem moment with the left having gone very far, and maybe that's what cost them, and maybe they should reflect on that kind of stuff. But now, moving from that, like, how do we just your expertise and just even your human experience, how do we have that conversation with people in a compassionate way, and people who are willing to hear it? But then, okay, now let's move to like what this issue of authoritarianism is, and how do we just watch ourselves moving forward to not get stuck in these traps as much as we have. Maybe that's just a diffuse and too big a question, but what do you think moving forward now we can do as academics and just as people, researchers and people?
I love your question. It's always dangerous to ask an academic a large, diffuse question. Okay, you better buckle up for a long answer. But okay, I'll try to keep this brief. So, I first want to say something about the academic side, and then I'll talk about the question, which I think mostly what you were asking was about the other side, the cultural and personal side. But the academic side, look, you've been asking the right questions here, and I don't think we're asking those questions enough, which is the question that most interests me, and we've tried to write about this. We've published a paper about it where we developed a theory that sort of tested similarities and differences and made predictions about that between left and right-wing authoritarians. But what I think academically we need is to better come up with theories that cover the whole picture. So we don't have a lot of theories that predict when left-wing authoritarians would be different and similar to right-wing authoritarians.
Mm.
We have a paper under review right now looking at left-wing, right-wing authoritarians and right-wing, left-wing authoritarians. There are some people who say they're right-wing, but they score high on the left-wing authoritarianism scale and vice versa. Those
Wow.
people, those people are at a crossroads. They're interesting psychological cases, and we're just not doing enough, in my opinion, as academics to understand to have a theory of what would happen. Like, those people just don't fit, but they're real people. They actually do have that psychology. They're not fake. So, okay. So that's the academic side. About the other side, look, in liberal bullies, you say, what do we do now? In liberal bullies, I talk about a couple principles that are relevant here. Okay.
That's it.
Yeah. Thank you
right
for
here.
that. I appreciate the plug.
Yes.
So, I get to ask this question a lot. Well, how do you convince an extreme left-wing authoritarian? And I've jokingly said in the past, I've quoted Captain Kirk from Star Trek and said, well,
Yep.
what do you do with them? And I say, prayer, Mr. Savick. Left-wing authoritarians don't take prisoners. And I do think that to some degree, you're not going to persuade every extreme left-wing authoritarian out of their ideology, okay? But we're talking about what is going to work at this moment in our culture to reduce the likelihood of left-wing authoritarianism in the future. And that is pretty plain. I don't think that's complicated psychologically. It's persuade, don't bludgeon, win graciously. Okay. Like, that's actually one of the lines in the principles is win graciously. Well, we're at a moment where the left-wing authoritarians just got crushed in the last election. Okay.
Right.
Woke authoritarianism took a huge hit in terms of its power in the last election. So here's the question then becomes, what are right-wing people who have power going to do? This is one of the key moments in our nation's history. If right-wingers go on a revenge tour, let's say, okay, if right-wingers start going after left-wingers in the way that left-wingers did to us over the past few years, if that's what happens, all we're going to do is sow the seeds of future left-wing authoritarianism. So it feels good in the moment to do that for some folks. That, it's a natural human instinct, I think. Okay, they did this to us, I'm going to do that to them. But that will just lead to more future authoritarianism down the road, which is bad for everybody. We don't want that. So principle applied equally. That doesn't mean you don't go after people who commit crimes, okay? It means that you go after left-wing and right-wing people equally for the same kinds of crimes. Do you see? So we're at a key moment here where I just urge people to try find common ground with others. Let's apply principles equally. Let's don't go on some kind of a right-wing authoritarian inspired binge tour, because it feels good a lot of times in the short term, but in the long term, you're actually the freedoms that you deny your enemies will be the freedoms that your enemies deny your children. Like, in the long term, it's actually going to be bad for everybody. So I think that there's a clear path here. Okay. And now here's what happens when you do that. Here's what happens. Do you convince every left-wing? There's no magic formula for convincing a left-wing authoritarianism to reconsider. There's no magic formula for that. And it won't work for all of them. But it will work for a lot of the people in the middle who had kind of tolerated it. It'll work for a lot. Yeah. It'll work for a lot of those people. And some of those left-wing authoritarians, you never know who they are until you try to show reason and compassion and so on. Okay, you never know. When I wrote a chapter with Peter Sudfeld and Dana Layton, I was actually the third author on it, but I wrote this chapter with them on we wrote a chapter to international negotiators was the target of the book chapter. And we were trying to write a chapter about the question, how should you negotiate in a crisis? And we said to them, look, if some of your opponents are going to go to war with you no matter what you say, and you need to be ready for that. But if you go into every negotiation and you never give a complex response, you never try to think about things from their point of view, you never try to work through a complex and hard solution at first, they definitely will go to war with you. So you ought to try. You don't know who the ones are always who won't and will, and we got to try to increase the probability. Maybe it's doomed. Maybe we won't ever come out of this spiral, but the best we can do is try. So that's what I would say to that question. A long and probably redundant answer to your excellent question, but that's how I think about that issue.
No, I think that's an excellent answer. I mean, just to just add my own 2 cents, I think we're ripe for some pretty positive stuff down the road because people in the academy, like Heterodox Academy, the group that
Mm-hmm.
I think we're both part of, and
We
if, am
are.
I correct in saying, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I
it's
love
like
heterodox. Yeah.
it's wonderful. It's not just about stomping your feet and get rid of CRT and all. It's about how do we actually address the issue
Mm-hmm.
of the disparate outcomes, and how do we look at that from an honest point of view, and actually like the sort of Roland Fryers of the world who are looking at issues in the black community, and actually stating things that are not being said because of fear of castigation and canceldom, but how do we, those of us who actually care, and there are many of us who care about the issues meaning the social issues that have been essentially abducted by this more authoritarianism bent. I think you're right. There's fertile ground to have actual discussions. We can now, not, I hate saying we can now as if the election was in many ways it kind of was, to be
Mm-hmm.
honest, that
I agree
that
with that.
relieved us from this stranglehold, but hopefully we can now have discussions that ought to be had, and come together in a productive, adaptive way rather than just hating on each other so much. But um so I really I appreciate your words, and the work that you do. I've been following your work since I had my post 2020 moment, and there's other authors too. I've been looking at it on left-wing authoritarianism and just generally authoritarianism, and it's been very eye-opening. And I encourage everyone to pick up um, liberal bullies, what psychology teaches us about the left's authoritarian problem, but also to understand that Dr. Conway is not just beating the horn or honking the horn of left wing authoritarianism, but broadly the issue at hand as it pertains to authoritarianism, but just putting a putting a bit of a focus on this as it's needed to be focused upon. And I think reading the book would help you understand this complex problem. But so anyway, I want to thank you. Is there anything that you want to mention, or any last bit of information? Maybe stuff you're working. You mentioned you're working on some new projects, or any events or anything like that, or
Yeah, we're working right now on political group phobia. That's one of my new focal points, and it's
wow,
tied to
yeah,
authoritarianism, amongst other things. So we've just part of the data we've been collecting has been trying to answer the question: do people actually have, like we always talk about transphobia and this phobia, or Trump
uh huh,
derangement syndrome? So we're looking into, we developed some scales to measure, do people actually have phobias of these groups? And the short answer is yes, but not very many of people, not nearly as many as people claim. So what are they like, and how many of, so that's a current interest of ours. And we're also doing a lot of work that's not directly related to authoritarianism, about what causes complex thinking and the relationship of things like disease to political leaders' complexity. So yeah, we're always doing stuff that's kind of out there, I think.
it's very exciting. Yeah,
But
that's
anyway, thank
it.
you for having me on here. It's
Yeah,
been so delightful, and I appreciate all the work that y'all are doing at
yeah,
Heterodox there. It's really exciting to see this new generation of heterodox people, excuse me, um, have come to life here. So I appreciate that.
yeah. No, thank you, and Dr. Conway. It's been Professor Conway, I never know what to refer to you guys.
Luke is fine.
Doctor.
Okay. Yeah.
Luke. Well, I mean, it's a pleasure to finally get the chance to interact with you like this, and I just yeah, thank you again, and I can't wait to catch up on the research you're doing, and keep the conversation going. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was an honor, and I've really enjoyed it. It was
Likewise.
great.